Let's talk forearm, shall we? Okay, with your forearm, we need to consider the elbow, right? But also, again, try to simplify the shape of the forearm as much as possible. So in the service of that, let's just take a look at the two really common positions of the forearm from the front and from the back. So first off, here's your upper arm, and here's your lower arm. If we're thinking about the arm as being in a palm out, right, position and elbows flat at the side. Now the arm itself, right, does this because your humerus, aka your upper arm bone, has this general overall shape to it, which forces your ulna, fancy word for pinky bone, and your radius out at a particular angle. Radius, fancy word for thumb bone. Okay, so this happens quite naturally just because of the angle of that section there. But that, again, doesn't change anything about the simplicity of these shapes. Now, again, from here out to the end of the hand, if we're in that palm out position, this whole block of space basically represents all the fingers and the block of the hand, and that will be equally true, obviously, from the back as well. And we're adding information to the outside and the inside of the hand, palm and pinky side, as a way of flushing that area out. Now this area here then is basically all one rectangular blob. And what we're doing up here is adding that little tent that comes down to that halfway point, both from the outside and or from the front and from the back. And also now looking for this chunk of that hinge that we were talking about in the first half of the class as being a good indicator as to where these muscles have to occur, right? So that junction point should occur quite naturally if we brought these two shapes overlapping with each other. And then on the front, we're going to have a bit of a triangular section here caused by the interrelationship of the bottom of the bicep, your brachialis, as well as your extensors. Right, so now this big muscle here overlaps the underside of the arm, but always comes down and attaches to the thumb side of the hand. This is where names of stuff start to become a little bit more important. This muscle here is called your brachioradialis, brachus meaning arm, and then radialis meaning your thumb side of your forearm. So this muscle has to attach to the 1/3 mark of your upper arm and the radius side of your lower arm. And that's regardless of the position that the arm's in, right? So this always attaches to the outside and then always comes down and attaches to the thumb side of your hand. Likewise, all of your flexors have to attach here. So all of your flexors, and there's 4 of them, right? But we can effectively reduce them into a single volume. The majority of the volume, right, being here, creating this belly, and then these things gradually branching out into 2 really obvious tendons, right? Those obvious tendons are these 2 tendons right here. One is responsible for flexing your fingers, the other one responsible for flexing the entirety of your wrist. Okay, so these things here basically are represented by one big volume, and people have been representing those by one big volume from the beginning of the Renaissance until now. Okay, so if it's good enough for us, basically it's good enough for them. Okay, this triangle gets mimicked on the back of the arm with that same triangle that we were looking at beforehand, which is this thing here, and your humerus from the back. And it looks exactly the same, except now your ulna, right, so your pinky side bone, terminates in this little bone here, right, that pushes up against the surface of the skin, right? So this thing is always visible. And it always attaches to this bone here that we talked about in the first half of class. That bone right there, fancy word for it, is called your Olecranon process. and it's always in behind your humerus, right? So it always sets up like this, and this big triangular chunk of it will always be visible as well. And then we get the triangle of your lateral and medial epicondyle of your upper arm bone, this bone, and this bone, pushing up against the surface to different degrees in different positions. Now, what's important about the extensors on this side is that just like these things start on this side of the arm, right, and then gradually migrate over like this, right, with these two here being really visible, your extensors do the exact opposite. They start on the other side, right, and attach to this epicondyle. And even though this big one comes down like this and attaches to the thumb, the other ones come across and do that. So it's the exact reverse. It's the exact reverse of what's happening on the other side. And so this will be useful to know because all of these things then will have to come down and fan out into your extenders, right? So this big muscle you can't really see, it just kind of comes down and runs along this bone, right? But the one that's wedged up second to that comes straight down the middle of the arm, and it fans out into these tendons on the back of the hand, right? This is your extensor digitoris common, or digitoris communis, something like that. Anyway, it's the thing that controls the flexion or the extension of all of your little fingers. Okay, so this is nice to know, right? But realistically, how this shows up on the back of the arm, if we find this, we find those things. This little tent goes in here. This thing here creates an indentation underneath that arm before where all of the other extensors latch on. And then this bump here shows us where the flexors attach. And because their flexors are on the underside of the arm, this has to overlap like that. And then because this attaches to the side of the arm, that has to overlap like that in that section. So these provide more of a guideline in terms of where shadow shapes are going to take place, but then also where this big triangular shape starts to take place as it moves down towards the head of the bone that it has to be attached to. Now, the complexity of the forearm is not only because of the array of muscles that we have in here, but also because you've got a different kind of joint in the forearm. So there's a little ball that sits on this section of the arm. And this is where your radius sits up underneath. And your radius sits in front of your ulna, right? So this thing always goes to the back of the arm. This thing always goes underneath the arm. Now, what this little ball here allows the radius to do is it allows it to twist like this, right? And it'll basically bring the lower section of the ulna along with it. So when we get the hand in a position where the hand is now moving from this position to this position, what ends up happening is that first off, the overall shape of the arm simplifies even more in the sense that this thing now no longer has that angle at the elbow. But now what it's doing is starting to expose a bit of the side of the forearm up here, and it's shifting, just for our purposes, the thumb over to this side of the hand. Let me move my paper because it's going to be easier to draw this. Okay, so as this thing twists, towards the inside, what that means is that these two bones also twist. So now your radius is on the inside of the arm, and your ulna is on the outside of the arm, which means that this muscle here is going to follow suit with it. That muscle now is, even though it creates this really big bulge here, that muscle now is entirely internal to the silhouette of the pose and comes down and attaches there, which also means that you're not going to be able to see this bone here or the attachments of all of those other extensors, but they do overlap now in a predictable way. They all have to be doing this, right? And then your triceps go in behind there. Your bicep still goes underneath that. This bone will still be in the same spot, but you'll be able to see a really light maybe impression of it. And then all of your flexors basically hardly change the direction of that thing. So what I was referring to beforehand is that even though the lower arm is quite complex, there's very little that actually needs to be done to that at a gestural level or a basic structural level, because that whole arm is effectively just this. Right? And you can get a lot of mileage out of this just by having your deltoid overlap in the proper position, pushing the bulge of this little bone up against the surface here, and having your tricep go behind a basic representation of the forearm, and having your bicep do much the same. So there's not really much there in terms of changing the overall shape, but this is also why you want to keep this area here so solid in terms of its volume. Now, how these things might show up, if we look at that initial, I don't know why this fucking phone has changed its format so radically. It's super irritating. If we look at that simple shape from the first half of class, with the arm just like this. Once I find this here, I can track that up roughly diagonally to this point here. Can also find roughly, right, where the hinge of that elbow is going to be, right, because this thing is now stuffed underneath there, and this thing is doing that. This big muscle here comes up to the 1/3 mark of your upper arm, but again, it has to go to your thumb side. Right, so that means that that thing is disappearing to the other side of that shape. This next muscle attaches directly underneath it, right on top of that guy, and it has to go in front of this, and it has to follow suit because it's going to just inside of this on the thumb side. And then your next muscle attaches directly next to that, and it goes right down the middle of your arm. All of this, for all intents and purposes, is bone, right, or really thin muscle. Okay, so what you get there is a predictable sense of overlap. You get this, followed by that, followed by that. Now again, in most instances, this isn't going to be, right, and then the head of your humerus sits up directly underneath that. And then all of your flexors from this position have to go in behind here and then go up and attach to the bottom of the hand. So they'll just overlap that, like that. Triceps, we already know we're doing this. That means that the bicep has to be doing that. And your deltoid coming down and doing that. Okay, now if we look at that same arm from the inside, that initial shape doesn't vary at all. Now the hinge of the elbow is going to be right here, and this is where all of your flexors now take place. So those things have to come up as a ball and then come down to the middle of the underside of the thumb. Now the thumb side and your radius pushes up against the surface of the skin, even though it's not quite as apparent as this, right? But it creates a big triangular wedge here that these muscles and tendons have to go underneath, just like the flexors have to go in behind wherever your thumb is. Okay. Now this muscle, again, starts on the outside of your arm, but it's still going to overlap the arm or your forearm and come down to the side of this thing. So it's going to create a little bit more volume there. So you don't even see the other muscles from the inside. And then through here, you'll have your bicep, brachialis running right down the middle, and then your tricep, which is effectively just doing this, but we can again divide it up a little bit more specifically if we so choose. Okay, so this is a nice way of subdividing that area of the body, right? But again, aren't necessarily details. They just more kind of like help to understand what's happening with, like, for instance, like shadow shapes, right? In this instance here, shadow shapes would start to occur here, here, and here as those things started to overlap each other, and then much more prominently here as they come up against that bone. Same thing here. Why do shadow shapes occur here and then shift as they start to hit the belly, the underside of all of those muscles? So Lindsay, let's do a 10-minute pose, please. And I'll do a quick demonstration of this. And then we will finish off, we'll with a 15-minute, and then I'll give you guys your assignments, and then we'll all shed a single tear for our collective farewell. Okay, guys, sorry, that's a pretty decent page for you guys to screenshot for the forearm. Okay, it's great. Okay, so again, simplifying this shape, as well as the shape that it's attached to, coming down from the shoulder. to maintain volume, right? And then also to make it easier for me to start placing stuff on top of that. Same thing here. This is again another good example of right how we can deal with this thing as planes, right? As we get one plane kind of going back in space like this, another plane kind of coming forward in space like so. Gives me a rough idea of what the simplification of this shape needs to be, but again, solidifying that all the way from here down to, in this case, the foreshortened front of the hand. You can think about this a bit three-dimensionally at this point, right, to help to identify where the side of the arm is, right, and where that deltoid now has to come down and attach to, and then force my tricep out to the side of. Also, this is now going to help to identify where this extensor has to be. It now comes over, right, provides a little bit of volume and attaches here. You can see we've got this little bulge right there. That extensor comes down like this. The other ones attach directly underneath it, and then basically move down towards the center of the arm. And behind that is your Olecranon process, right? It having to be now attached to the head of your ulna, which is right there. And because that has to go underneath, or over top of rather, the bulge of the outside muscles of your pinky side, that goes there. And now we have a little bit of a bulge of your flexors still visible there. Tendons of the thumb overlap your stuff there. Okay, so graphically, right, this isn't going to be as obvious, because what is more apparent here is this change of contour as I go over top of that extensor into the inside of the elbow, and then over top of the flexors on the other side. So that's another nice way of starting to put that in. Right? Although the other way would be an accurate way of starting to put that information in a graphic sense. And then basically what we have here is the ridge of those muscles. And you can see how they change direction here as they go from one major muscle group to another major muscle group, and then into the bones of the wrist. Okay, so graphically what you might want to do, right, in terms of accentuating that is just make sure that something like that was happening there. And so all those really help to do, right, in something like this is to really identify the graphic nature of the structure. Okay, there again is my Olecranon process coming straight up towards the head of my wrist, forcing my flexors underneath there. And again, forcing the arm bones, or rather the pinky side muscle underneath that. This muscle again bulging, right, and then coming up and attaching to the outside third of the arm, just like your deltoid is attaching to the outside third of the arm. Finding this here, right, so that all of this can start to occur. And then that highlight that's occurring here being or identifying the head of your ulna, and then all of these shadow shapes in their change of direction, identifying not only the head of the humerus, right, but also the belly, the beginning of the belly of each one of those forearm bones. And then again, just exaggerating the overlap. In order to make that look a little bit more structurally accurate. Thank you, Lindsay. Okay. All right, everyone. Let's finish off with a 15-minute pose. Okay, and yeah, then we'll talk shop about assignments and stuff like that, and end of year, and wish you all good luck, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, gang. So last time down the track. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the expressive use of your line, as opposed to kind of like the way that we've been going about it, the practical application of your line. So what I mean by like the practical application of your line is that we basically started this class where the class finishes, right? In the sense that when we were doing math studies, right, and I was asking you to do stuff like this, that was in the service of filling up volume, but also seeing the pose in an entirely different way. I was kind of obliquely describing different kinds of lines that you'd be using to develop that mass with. Some of those lines were thick, some of those lines were thin, some of those lines were round and curvy, other lines were straight and sharp and jagged. And then beyond this point, we'd be moving from light lines into dark lines. Now, in addition to this kind of line, what we've also gone over is to say, if we're developing this leg a little bit further, we've done stuff like blocking, right? We're reducing the complexity of curves and stuff into more geometric shapes so that it becomes a bit easier to make those geometric shapes, or rather those simplified forms of the body, easier or more accurate, because those straight lines tend to be a little bit easier to hit more accurately than curved lines. So there's that kind of line application as well, which is quite a bit more analytic and academic. But then towards the end of the pose is like, we need to come back to these kinds of lines, right? And start thinking about thick and thin, light and dark, as a way of starting to develop some expression in the pose. So a simple example of that might be, say, as I come down the thigh, right, and introduce a shadow, I can introduce a thick line that's relatively light as a way of inscribing that transition line. Oh, it's noisy on the street. And then bring a different kind of line up thickly in the opposite direction as a way of describing a shadow. So that's a usefulness of a different kind of line application that then describes something technical that we've been going over. Likewise, you can take this type of line, right, and now start to apply it in a more expressive sense as you move from light and dark, thick and thin, right, and describing the edge of the pose. And basically what this gets away from is treating your line like this. Or if I was to describe this other leg, and I can block it in exactly the same way. But a default way of doing this is to do this. Where you take that same basic kind of line structure that we're using for blocking and making that line basically uniformly thick and uniformly dark, which essentially kills any sort of the expression of the line. Now, this is okay if we keep that line relatively light, and it will be useful in certain contexts. Right? But what we're really looking for, right, is something that has not only a bit of expression to the line, right, but also something that feels like it is a little bit more controlled. So rather than a line like this, we're getting a line like that carries both control and expression within it. And ideally applying those types of lines to the area of the pose that is best described by a certain kind of line. So the reason that this doesn't really carry a lot of polish to it is that when we make little lines like this, what you're essentially doing is overlapping really small strokes in relationship to each other as a way of trying to get that line more accurate, which is why it's useful for, say, this blocking section, because that's the purpose of that section. When we get into the polished section, right, the more expressive section, this always looks like a line that doesn't feel confident, right, because it doesn't exactly know where the edge of the body is, right, and it doesn't really describe a comfortability with the pencil. So I'm going to talk more about this as we kind of go forward through the different pose lengths, right? But this is essentially what we're going to do today, is right, start applying these different kinds of lines, different kinds of expressive description to the pose. But I'd like you to think about doing, again, going back to the first half of the class, in order to maximize what it is that you're doing, or what it is that you're able to do with the pencil. If you're dealing with a pencil or a material that allows you to do this, and if you're drawing digitally, this probably isn't going to work very well unless you start to incorporate different tools into your set, is holding the pencil differently so that you can expose not only a thin section of the pencil, but also a thick section of the pencil without changing your grip on the pencil. This grip on the pencil only allows you to do this. This grip on the pencil allows you to do this and this just by changing the angle of your wrist. Now, what this means inside of a short study is that as you get more familiar with the shapes that we've been dealing with and the gestural aspect of the pose, you can start to incorporate not only structure, but expression into the pose at the same time as you start to incorporate different kinds of line, density, movement, weight, right, et cetera, right? And this is what starts to develop into an individual style. Now, ultimately, this takes just as much practice as doing anything that we've done in the class up until this point. So if you're going to continue the subject, right, and you're going to be doing that at least for one more term with Drew, what I would recommend is, like, at the beginning of each individual class, is just doing shit like this. Drawing circles, drawing curves, transitioning between curves and straight lines, essentially just kind of like scribbling the same way that we were at the beginning of the course, right, but not directed by any particular pose. And what you're trying to do is develop muscle memory in terms of what it feels like to make certain shapes, because ultimately then those certain shapes are going to be applied to a glute, right, a hip, right, a leg, right, a shadow, a shade, right, etc. As you start to describe the pose in a little bit more individualistic and expressive of a manner. So, Miss Massey, could we do some 30-second poses, please? And I'll just do a couple of quick examples of what I mean by this in putting into practice. And what you'll find when you start concentrating on this more so than, say, the anatomy and accuracy that we've gone over, is that your accuracy and your anatomy will ultimately start to suffer, right? Until those two things become integrated with each other. And this is why that formula is so important, right? Because that formula effectively allows you to concentrate on how you're applying the pencil without really having to worry about what you're applying it to. Right, so we've got the same basic structure there, but something entirely different in terms of the way that that comes across because of a different line application. Okay, so that doesn't mean that we're abandoning everything that we know about structure. This means it's like as you start to put these structural lines down, there can be a bit of flair in terms of how you put them down. Once you start concentrating on what those lines are meant to look and feel like, as opposed to just being accurate. But what is generally the case at the beginning of the pose anyway is that you're keeping your initial lines relatively light. And if this is if for no other reason, then you'll see people get really good at doing 30-second poses, really good at doing 2-minute poses, 5-minute poses, etc., because they've essentially developed tricks that work really well for each one of those individual poses or pose lengths. But when they get beyond those pose lengths, right, especially longer poses, if you've just developed tricks to make a 30-second leg look good, right, say just by doing that, well, if you ever have to move this thing and change it, it becomes really difficult to do anything about that because the way that you put it down basically prohibits you doing anything about it. Okay, so I can still apply structure and gesture. And some expressive line movement all at the same time. And at the beginning, so that later stages or longer drawings, right, have the opportunity rather to be developed further. What you might want to do is just concentrate on trying to keep that line relatively light. Right, so even if you do have some expressive value to your line, you have the ability to build on top of it as well. Okay, so let's give that a try. And let's just warm up with some 30-second poses. Stage is yours, Miss Massey. when you're applying these more expressive lines, right, to particular areas of the body, try and think about it like as memorizing a barcode, right, or some short sequence of numbers, right, where you might have, you know, anywhere between 1 and 4 different curves or areas that you're accessing, but you're not trying to draw down the entire silhouette of the body, right? So for instance, like on the back of a leg, you might try to grab that as an area that you're describing, right? And same thing here, like maybe that area, as opposed to this area, that area, that area, that area, and that area. That's too much, right, for you to try to get down in a controlled manner. So what helps, anyway, what helps I've found is by limiting the extent to which you're going to be taking your pencil as you start to describe things, either academically, right, or right, expressively. Right? So in terms of accuracy, or in terms of something that's privileging the expression of line over top of it. Okay, so now inside this, as I start to build this up, right, I can be relatively expressive, right, with the line that I'm putting down to build up the structure, with an awareness that I'm trying to keep it relatively light. Some of those light lines might end up working quite well, so you don't necessarily want to get rid of them altogether, but you also don't want them to necessarily be so dark that if they're not something that you like, that you can't get rid of them. Jesus Christ. Be funny that after like a couple minutes of those sirens dying away, that, you know, some tactical team burst into the door behind me and dragged me out the back. Okay, as you're putting this down, you're inevitably going to experience, right, something that is less accurate, but hopefully something that feels a bit more expressive as well. Ultimately, I mean, these things blend together and become more accurate than not. Oof, giving you a pretty beefy torso. Okay, so that we get something that's, you know, a little bit more fun to look at, right? Just because of the types of lines that are being put down. But you know, it's like all the lines are relatively short, right? It's like the longest ones that I'm putting down are maybe, say, this one here, this one here. Right? There's not an effort to go all the way from here all the way down to here, and I'm still not getting all that much done in terms of the details that I'm developing. Right? You're just trying to make those details a little bit more fun to look at. All right, so let's give that a go for some 5-minute poses.